I'm a Viking. Sitting in my fortress, thoughts of death are morbid. Blood from the tortured, body bags and corpses. Life is full of letdowns and obstacle courses. Pull up in a bucket and put bullets in your Porsche. I'm nefarious, lyrical terrorist. Heisenberg's.
Hello and welcome, we're the Aussie Guys. I'm AJ here, on my own again in Aussie Guys Studio for another team preview. This time it's Vikings. And we had this guy on last year. He was fantastic. I'm just going to give him a call in a second. Chris Gates from the Daily Norseman. And you can give him a follow at Daily Norseman. And also look him up on the web at the Daily Norseman. Let's get him on the line, talk Vikings. All right, so I've got Chris on the line right now. Chris, a warm welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Adrian. How are you guys doing over there?
Yeah, very good, very good. It's fantastic to have you on for another Vikings preview, and there's been, well, it was a very, very exciting year for the Vikings last year, and there's been a whole lot of movement, a whole lot of things have happened in the off-season as well, Chris.
There certainly was. It was a great season up until that last game in Philadelphia that didn't quite go the way we wanted it to, but other than that, we can't argue with the season we had. Everything was pretty good, and yeah, there's been some pretty significant changes that have taken place in the meantime. So it's going to be an interesting season again this year too. It looks like. Yeah,
my word. I wrote down a little bit of a summary, but it was a very exciting season. I left out most of the stuff in the middle because, to be honest, I mean the Vikings won the NFC North. It was the second time in 3 years that they had done that, finishing with a 13-3 record. They went into the playoffs as a number 2 seed in the NFC. In the divisional round, I guess most memorably, came up against the Saints and what's now been dubbed the Minneapolis Miracle, with 10 seconds remaining. Trailing by a point, the Vikings lined up 3rd and 10 on their own 39-yard line, and that's when quarterback Case Keenum threw the ball to wide receiver Stephon Diggs inside field goal range near the right sideline, which gave him a chance to get out of bounds, but safety Marcus Williams missed the tackle, and Diggs ran down the sideline unopposed for the game-winning score. Incredibly exciting. And the Vikings went on to the NFC Championship for an opportunity to get into the Super Bowl, only to lose 38-7 to the eventual Super Bowl champion, the Philadelphia Eagles. So I guess, there's so many things that the Vikings can hang their hat on. One of them is, I guess, losing to the eventual Super Bowl winner, which is, never a bad thing, is it? Because, if you got beaten by the team that won it all, that's not so bad.
I guess it's not as bad as it could have been, but, with the Vikings and their history and the way things have gone for them over the years, it would have been a lot nicer if it had been them playing the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl instead. But I guess that there is an upside to losing in the NFC Championship game. I guess the team that beat us wound up winning the whole thing. So yeah, it's not a great thing, obviously. But, it's better than what it could have been, I suppose.
It was certainly, it was an exciting season. I'm trying to find a silver lining in what was ultimately very disappointing finish. And I guess one of the things that was quite disappointing is the fact that, the Vikings defense, which was so strong and, one of the best defenses in the entire league all year, really kind of faltered right at the end to give up 38 points. That's one of the most disappointing things about it as well.
It definitely was. The Vikings were the number 1 defense in the NFL last year in both points allowed and yardage allowed. And, they didn't really have a lot of injury issues on the defensive side of the ball. Everyone stayed fairly healthy most of the way. And, like you said, they just kind of fell on their face at exactly the wrong time and, lost an opportunity to play a Super Bowl in their home stadium, which would have been a first-time ever thing. And, I don't know if they're going to get an opportunity to have that anytime in the future. I don't know if Minneapolis is going to host another Super Bowl anytime soon, but yeah, it was disappointing. But, all that defensive talent is back pretty much, and, we should expect them to be strong again this coming season. So hopefully we'll get more of the same results.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you mentioned that. I forgot to mention that they did have that opportunity, obviously, to play a Super Bowl in their home stadium, which, yes, would have been a first, and obviously is also disappointing for people in Minnesota. Free agency, so interestingly, Rick Spielman has been incredibly busy in free agency. All the quarterbacks that were on the roster in 2017 are gone, so the quarterback room was cleaned out completely. Case Keenum, Teddy Bridgewater, and Sam Bradford. And interestingly, we'll talk more about Kirk Cousins in a little bit, but it's kind of interesting that, Case Keenum had such a fantastic year. He wasn't really necessarily the thing that was broken, but all three quarterbacks are out of the building. Kirk Cousins comes in as sort of that marquee signing of the offseason. Trevor Siemian comes in via trade from the Broncos. Pat Shurmur, your offensive coordinator, is also gone. Not because you wouldn't have wanted to keep him, but he was in demand. Jerick McKinnon, you've lost Jarius Wright as well. But another big free agent signing is Sheldon Richardson, defensive tackle, who will slot into a D-line that's going to be incredibly scary. But free agency, Chris, what's your take on, I guess, the Kirk Cousins signing overall? But what was your feeling in free agency as a whole?
So, as far as the quarterback situation goes, I guess I wasn't terribly surprised by the fact that all three of the Vikings quarterbacks wound up getting cut loose or having their contract expire. Bradford, once it became apparent that he just can't stay healthy anymore for whatever reason, he wasn't going to be a factor. And as much as I love Teddy Bridgewater, and I was a huge Bridgewater fan since he was drafted, the Vikings got to see him every day since his injury, and they obviously didn't think he was the guy that they were going to be able to go forward with. And as far as Case Keenum, Mike Zimmer just never really, I don't think, got behind him 100%. He had a great season, obviously, but the seasons he had before that were kind of average to below average. And, with bringing in a new offensive coordinator, they said that the new offensive coordinator, John DeFilippo, had a great deal of input as to who he wanted to have as the quarterback running his offense this season. And he's shown a lot of consistency over the last few seasons. I believe he's the only quarterback in the NFL that's thrown for at least 4,000 yards and 25 touchdowns in each of the last three seasons. And he did that in Washington with a supporting group that I don't think is nearly the quality of players he's going to be surrounded by in Minnesota. So that I think it's an upgrade. I know there are a lot of people out there that are still skeptical about it. They're not sure if it's necessarily an upgrade over what the Vikings had last season, but I'm relatively certain that it is. And if it is, then this team is going to be much better. I don't know if you can say much better than they were last year when they went 13-3, but they should be at least as good as they were last year, if not better.
Yeah, and you've got to think that with a move like Cousins' move, certainly, or Sheldon Richardson, but you've got to think with those sorts of moves, that signals the front office is really making a push. I'm not going to say Super Bowl or bust, because it's not bust, but the push is for the Super Bowl. That really is what it is.
It definitely is. And I think they're sending a signal that they've put together this roster that's one of the most talented in the National Football League on both sides of the ball. Obviously, the defense is very good, like we've already talked about, and the Sheldon Richardson addition is just going to make them that much better, I think. But, they decided that the quarterback position was the one thing that might have been holding them back. And like I said about Keenum earlier, we don't know if he is going to be able to sustain that level of success now that he's going on to a team that might not be as solid or as talented as Minnesota is. whereas Cousins was putting up very good numbers with lesser talent around him. So, yeah, the Vikings decided, the coaching staff decided, Rick Spielman decided that Cousins was to be the guy. And, yeah, I think you're right. I think it does signal that this team knows they're in the window for a Super Bowl, and they need to try to take advantage of that. And the Cousins signing is a big part of how they're going to try to go about that.
Yeah, let's touch on the draft really quickly before we talk a little bit more about some of the skill positions. But I don't have a strong feeling about the draft, and I don't know if you feel sort of positive or negatively. Drafts are always so hard. I mean, you can't really assess a draft. It's very hard to do that. But certainly in the first round at number 30, Rick Spielman decided to go for a cornerback, which seems to be his play. Really, it's a fairly common play for the Vikings in picking Mike Hughes out of UCF, which is not what you wouldn't have called it an area of need. Certainly adding some depth to a strength of the defense. I think many people would have perhaps predicted the Vikings going for an O-lineman, and they certainly did that in the second round in picking Brian O'Neill, an offensive tackle. And then in the fourth round, Jalen Holmes, a defensive end out of Ohio State. And the fifth round, Tyler Conklin, a tight end out of Central Michigan. I didn't list all the players in the draft, but just sort of the first, sort of the earlier round guys. But what was your feeling about the draft in general, Chris?
I think along with everyone else, was kind of surprised that the Vikings didn't take an offensive lineman with that first selection of theirs at number 30 overall. I think that so many of us knew that the offensive line was the biggest weakness on the roster, and it probably still is. But the Vikings, I'm not sure if it's just the way their board worked out and they didn't think a guy as talented as Hughes was going to be there at number 30, because there were some projections just before the draft that had him going in the middle portion of the first round. So they might have thought he wasn't going to be there, and he might have clearly been the best guy left on their board, so they decided to go with him. I think that the Vikings may have also not fully anticipated the run on offensive linemen that started early in the second round. I think that they might have anticipated some of the top linemen actually falling to their spot at number 62. And once the second round started, those guys started flying off the board. And I don't know if it's necessarily a missed opportunity for the Vikings. I mean, I like Brian O'Neill. He's a very good athlete. He might need some time to develop, but he could potentially play a role this season. But yeah, I was surprised that they took Hughes, but with some of the contract situations in secondary and the fact that he could potentially work out as a return specialist as well, not the worst pick the Vikings could have made. I'm actually kind of excited to see what he does in training camp here coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, let's start talking about some skill positions. So let's go and start with the man of the offseason, Kirk Cousins. And you did allude to the fact that he's been very successful. Certainly 3 consecutive seasons of at least 4,000 yards and 25 touchdowns on, an offense which, on paper you wouldn't have said was one of the most high-flying or most talented offenses in the league. And the Vikings historically have only had 3 players post seasons like that in their 57-year history, and that's Dante Culpepper, Warren Moon, and Brett Favre. So, there's not like what you'd call a rich history of sort of having marquee quarterback. A move like this is, it's a play for just taking the team to the next level, and that's fair enough. But I guess on the reverse side of the ledger, the people who may be down on the Cousins signing would point to his career record, which is not really that flash. I think it's 26, 30, and 1. And he's rarely been in the playoffs, although, I think only once, and he lost. So, but again, I mean, that a product of that Washington team is not nearly as talented on either side of the ball as this Vikings team would appear to be. So we've covered a lot of Kirk Cousins, but what's your feeling? I was going to say, what are your hopes? We sort of know what everybody's hopes will be for the Kirk Cousins signing, but what's your feeling on that overall? Were you happy when the news dropped, or a little hesitant?
I was pretty happy when the news came down that the Vikings were going with Kirk Cousins. I mean, you watch the free agency market take shape, and Case Keenum went to Denver, and Sam Bradford went to Arizona, and Washington replaced Cousins with Alex Smith. And as you're watching guys sign in different places, I mean, you're quickly realizing that Minnesota is just about the only place left, and Cousins hasn't signed yet, so it became obvious that the Vikings were targeting him from the beginning, having let those other three quarterbacks go. And like you said, the Vikings have had quarterback issues. If you want to go all the way back to when Fran Tarkenton finally retired, I mean, they've been looking for franchise quarterbacks. They thought they had one in Culpepper for a few years, and then he had the knee injury that pretty much ended the productive portion of his career. And, yeah, it's just been a struggle for them at the quarterback position. They've gotten some guys that, you talked about Warren Moon, you talked about Brett Favre, guys that come in for a year or two, but they haven't really had that guy that's been the long-term answer, the long-term fix. They thought they had it in Bridgewater before his injury, and now they have a guy with Cousins who should be entering the prime years of his career, and it's rare that a guy like that hits the free agency market. And, he only signed a 3-year contract, so he knows he could be playing for his next contract as well, depending on how he does with Minnesota. So I'm pretty happy with the Cousins signing. I know a lot of people weren't. I mean, they probably feel that we could have spent less on someone like Keenum, or even rolling the dice with Bridgewater again. But, Cousins is that rare free agent quarterback that actually makes it to the market, and Rick Spielman decided they needed to jump on that opportunity. And, he obviously got the green light from the coaching staff and the offensive coordinator. And, those guys know more about this sort of thing than most of us do. So I think there's good reason for optimism with the Kirk Cousins signing.
Here's another reason for optimism if we go and talk about the running back position. So obviously Jerick McKinnon left in free agency for the 49ers, but I'd be interested in your take on that, because for many years, I mean, certainly Jerick McKinnon was playing behind Adrian Peterson for a while, and was sort of seen, I guess, as a little bit of an heir apparent, but I don't feel like he really rose to that next level, Otherwise we probably wouldn't have seen the Vikings draft Dalvin Cook in the second round last year. And, Dalvin Cook, I mean, he did his ACL in week 4. He was averaging 4.8 yards per carry, and, he was really excelling in the screen game. And, of course, with Latavius Murray sort of being a bit of a foil for Cook, they're a sort of a nice 1-2 punch. I mean, obviously Cook was the focus, but, I mean, that backfield, you really didn't have that backfield for pretty much the season, and you're getting that back. So it's almost like another addition in addition to the Kirk Cousins signing.
It really is. I mean, it's going to be great to see what Cook in this offense, because, like you said, he was clearly a space for himself among the NFL's top running back before he got hurt, and he just brings a completely different dimension to the offense. I mean, he's obviously a good runner. He can catch out of the backfield. He pass blocks better than a lot of younger running backs do. And, yeah, he's going to be a great addition to this offense. When you talk about McKinnon, I think everyone thought that the potential was always there with Jerick McKinnon. Like you said, he spent a couple of years backing up Adrian Peterson. But then when Peterson was hurt, or when Peterson was no longer there, the Vikings didn't feel comfortable enough to make him the primary guy. In 2016, when Peterson was hurt, he shared carries with Matt Asiata. Last year, after Cook got hurt, he shared carries with Latavius Murray. And, he's never put up the production that a running back that got the kind of money that the 49ers gave him should be producing. Is he going to actually go out and do that in the 49ers offense? Well, we don't know yet. He's obviously going to get every opportunity to do that. But, with the return of Cook, McKinnon obviously knew that there weren't going to be a lot of opportunities for him. Murray's in the last year of his contract, so he's going to be, once again, kind of the backup, kind of the contrast to Cook's style of play. And, it's going to be interesting, but, I think we're all looking forward to seeing how Dalvin Cook reacts. And, he's back and practicing now, but we want to see him a full go again like he was in the first few games of last year.
Oh, for sure. And we saw the amazing year Alvin Kamara had, but I think, by the time week 4 rolled around, Dalvin Cook was in the conversation for Rookie of the Year. And, he was having that good of a year. So if you're going to do your ACL, I guess you want to have it done. You want to do it sort of as early as possible in the season. So I presume he's back fully healthy for training camp now?
Yes, he actually got involved in the team drills during the mini camps and whatnot. They're probably going to limit him during the preseason. Obviously, they want him ready for week 1, but all indications are that he's going to be back at 100% and ready to go for the start of camp.
Now, wide receivers, and I might just lump the tight ends in with the receiving core, which is, an impressive receiving core. You had 2 receivers who managed to amass more than 1,000 yards. In fact, together, Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs combined for 155 catches and 2,125 yards and 12 touchdowns in 2017. And they were, a fantastic kind of 1-2 punch. I guess the big question really this year is number 3. Jarius Wright has gone, and Laquan Treadwell is somewhat of a disappointment, who is your 2016 first-round pick. At this stage, hopes are probably to get something out of him, and for him not to be a complete bust. I don't know if you have any news on that front. And obviously, at tight end, you've got Kyle Rudolph, who's, amongst one of the better tight ends in the entire league. And he returns to full strength after surgery to repair his ankle, which slowed him down late last year. But, Chris, the receiving core, just as a whole, obviously some really good pieces, but some question marks as well, sort of in the number 3 slot, I guess, in particular.
Yeah, obviously we've talked a lot about Diggs and Thielen. They may be the best 1-2 receiving punch in the league. Diggs is going to be one of those guys that has injury concerns. He's going to have minor nicks and whatever every year that are going to slow him down a little bit. But when he's up there, we've seen what he's capable of. Between him and Thielen, they are outstanding as the top 2 receivers. The number 3 guy, as you said, I think everyone would kind of like it to be Laquan Treadwell. He was obviously much better in 2017 than he was in 2016. Kirk Cousins has made a good use out of his number 3 wide receivers over the course of his career. He's targeted them quite a bit more than Vikings quarterbacks have targeted their number 3 receivers in recent memory. So maybe that's a good thing for Laquan Treadwell. The Vikings did bring in Kendall Wright on a 1-year contract, so he's going to be part of the conversation for the number 3 spot as well. It's going to be interesting to see how the depth chart shakes out. Like you said, Treadwell has not been incredibly productive over the course of his career to this point, and he's sort of running out of chances. This is his 3rd season. He signed a 4-year contract, as most rookies do, and this offseason the Vikings are going to have to decide whether or not they want to pick up the 5th-year option on his contract as a first-round pick. And if he doesn't step up this year, I think the odds of that happening are kind of slim. and this team is going to start actively searching for his replacement. But he could be one of the guys that really steps forward this year. It's just going to be a matter of how much chemistry he's built up with Kirk Cousins and how much trust Cousins has developed in him during his time in the offense so far.
Now, you alluded to the O-line being an area of need. Certainly last year, left tackle Riley Reif, who was a free agent signing, much prized in the offseason, solidified what was potentially the weakest position on the team. And then centre Pat Elfian stepped right into the starting lineup and excelled. He was a third-round draft pick. But there was lots of injuries. Right guard Joe Berger retired. You had a couple of free agent acquisitions I didn't mention at the top. Tom Compton and Josh Andrews, who will be competing. And then you've got Mike Remmers, who's going to join the competition. Right tackle, and the rookie Brian O'Neill, of course, we mentioned before, who was the second-round pick. But this is a unit that we're going to see probably quite a bit of movement and quite a bit of, fine-tuning, I guess, during training camp, I expect, Chris.
I'm of the assumption that Nick Easton, who was injured late last season in the win in Green Bay, is going to be the starter at left guard once again. So the left side of the line should be pretty well established. The right side of the line is going to be a little more interesting. The Vikings, despite getting decent play out of Remmers at right tackle last year, seem set on moving him inside to right guard, which is open up competition at the right tackle spot. I think everyone would kind of like to see O'Neill be the guy to claim the right tackle spot. He's going to have competition from Rashad Hill, and he was the one who wound up starting at right tackle when Remmers was injured for a few games last season. And yes, the offensive line, just like it was last year, is going to be one of the most fascinating situations to watch during training camp this year, not only for the starters, but to see who the Vikings keep around as depth, because as we've seen over the years, it's just as important to have depth on your offensive line as it is to have quality starters. And, hopefully the Vikings are going to be able to develop a few guys, and, if the worst happens and somebody gets injured, they'll have somebody that can slot in without a lot of drop-off.
Let's talk about the defense for a short time. It's such an incredibly strong group, really, from front to back. There's not a whole lot really to say, and there hasn't been a whole lot of change. We mentioned Sheldon Richardson. Let's just start with, you mentioned before that they led the league in fewest points and yards allowed before the playoffs. The whole defense was relatively injury-free as well, so that also helped. That D-line, if we can start with that, Everson Griffin, he had such a fantastic year, and Danielle Hunter on the other end, who's just an absolute physical freak, who, perhaps had a bit of a down year, but we know that he's incredibly talented. And then Linval Joseph, and you put in, Sheldon Richardson in next to Linval Joseph, and that defensive line looks incredibly scary.
It really does. You talked about Griffin. Had a great start to the season, had 10 sacks in the first 8 games, and then he had a injury on the last play of the game against Cleveland in London that kind of slowed him down for the rest of the year. He should be fully recovered from that. Obviously, the Vikings think pretty highly of Hunter, given the huge contract extension they just gave him to make sure he's under contract for another 5 years. And Joseph is a guy that they brought in free agency a couple of years ago. He wasn't really, I won't say he wasn't highly thought of. Obviously he was, but he was kind of under the radar. And he's not under the radar anymore, obviously, because of the way he's performed. And, like you said, the one defensive starter that the Vikings have changed, Tom Johnson was there next to Joseph last year. He started the games, even though he's more of a situational pass rush guy than a full-time defensive tackle, and he moved on to Seattle, and the Vikings have replaced him with Sheldon Richardson, who has been a defensive rookie of the year in the past. He's got an incredible amount of talent, and he's going to be the kind of disruption at that other defensive tackle spot. There's nobody you can really regularly double team on this Vikings offensive line because every one of those guys can beat single blocks on a regular basis. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Richardson fits in with his defensive line. Like you said, I think he's just going to make them that much more frightening. And, as long as they can develop some depth guys behind the four starters so that they don't wear down over the course of the season, I think this is probably the best and most talented defensive line in football.
Yeah, well, it'd be kind of hard to argue against you, to be honest. And if anything, if you go to the second level, the linebacking core may be the weakness of the defense, although it's kind of, it's all relative because this defense is really strong from front to back. And certainly you've got two great linebackers right in the center there, Eric Kendricks in the middle and Anthony Barr on the strong side. And both of those guys are just tackle machines, and they're fantastic to have in there. I just sort of have a bit of a question really about the depth at linebacker, but you can certainly cover up any sort of perceived weakness of that linebacker core. I mean, you've got, as you said, arguably one of the best D-lines in the league, and the secondary is, almost as impressive. So, you don't have to, those two lines can easily kind of cover for any sort of perceived weakness in the middle.
I mean, like you said, Barr and Kendricks are both very good at their positions. We're kind of interested to see what happens with Anthony as far as his contract is concerned. He's in the last year of his contract, and he's one of the guys the Vikings need to look at locking up long term. Kendricks has already been locked up long term, which is a good thing for the Vikings. As far as the rest of the linebacker core, the third linebacker is really, I don't think it's as important as it used to be, mostly because NFL teams spend so much time playing defenses where you only have two linebackers and 5 or 6 defensive backs. And yeah, they have players like Ben Gedeon, who was their 4th-round pick last year. It didn't get a lot of fanfare, but when he was on the field, he performed relatively well, I thought. But the majority of the linebacker snaps are going to go to Barr and Kendricks, and most of the other linebackers on the roster are going to be viewed as special teams type of guys, I think. And it's going to be interesting to see what they can develop behind Barr and Kendricks in the event that the worst happens.
Yes, and you sort of alluded to the fact that a lot of teams, can play, essentially play a lot of nickel and have sort of 5 defensive backs on the field. And the Vikings have got the personnel to do it, for sure. I mean, you've got free safety Harrison Smith, who's an all-pro, and Xavier Rhodes as the sort of 2 marquee names at the back there. And you've got a few other names. Trey Waynes is a bit of a work in progress. He did sort of make strides last year. Mackenzie Alexander is a little inconsistent, but again, he's got that high sort of draft pedigree. Strong safety Andrew Sandeo performs incredibly well. He's pretty reliable. And of course, you've got Mike Hughes, who you spent the 1st-round draft pick on this year. So there's lots of names there.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you look at corner. I mean, obviously Rhodes is the top guy. He's the guy that follows every team's best wide receiver. We don't have any questions about his ability. As you said, Trey Waynes has made significant strides over his rookie year. I think there are a lot of teams that Trey Waynes would probably be the number 1 cornerback on, but because he shares a backfield with Xavier Rhodes, that's probably never going to happen in Minnesota. Mackenzie Alexander, as you said, has some issues with consistency. Sometimes he looks outstanding. Sometimes he's getting beaten by guys that have no business beating him as far as talent levels are concerned. Terrence Newman is back again, but he's at the age where you don't know if he's going to be able to remain consistently playing at a high level or anything. And yeah, we're going to have to see how Mike Hughes slots in there. I don't know if he's going to immediately step in and be the nickel corner, if he's going to be more of a guy that's just there for now if somebody were to get injured or what have you. But the cornerback position is deep, and the safety position is relatively solid too, with Harrison Smith, who I still firmly believe is the best player on Minnesota's defense overall. Sendejo has improved markedly over the past few years. And even guys like Anthony Harris, who don't get a lot of opportunities to play because of how good those two safeties are. The secondary is just as stacked as the defensive line is, and in the National Football League today, you can't have too much depth at the defensive backs, so it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, on our previews, Chris, I have been asking people what they think their team's record will be and sort of what the hopes are, but I think it's certainly with the moves and with the expectation from last year, I think it's probably fairly obvious that they're shooting for the Super Bowl. They want to get to the Super Bowl for sure. But 13-3 last year, do you think they can do that again?
I think they're going to come close. If I had to put an actual record prediction on them for this year, I'd probably put them at about 12-4. Obviously, that's before you take any sort of potential injuries into account or anything like that. But this team has enough talent to go at least 12-4 and secure a high seed in the NFC playoffs once again. And they should be on the short list of teams that are talked about as Super Bowl possibilities out of the NFC. And I think they are definitely going to have the opportunity to get to Super Bowl 53.
It's going to be exciting to watch. Now, Chris, something we've been asking our guests to nominate is, we're just wondering, who do you think is a locker room guy at the Vikings? So who, and it doesn't have to just be one guy, but who do you think is the sort of motivational guy, the guy that's kind of bringing them together in the locker room?
I think if you had to go with a guy, you would probably have to go with Brian Robinson. Robinson has been on the team for longer than any other member of the Vikings. He thought about retiring this offseason, but decided to come back and give it one more go. He's been a big part of the defensive line over the past few years, and he's seen his role steadily decrease because of the emergence of Danielle Hunter at that defensive end spot. But he's been sort of the guy that he's got a great reputation among the players and the fans, and I think he's the one guy that's most capable of bringing everyone together in the locker room. I'm sure there are other guys that fall on that list as well, but when you ask that question, the first name that comes in my head is Brian Robinson.
Okay, well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. Obviously we're all looking forward to football season. It's getting closer and closer all the time now, and this Vikings team's going to be super exciting to watch, and I know that Vikings fans are going to be super excited for the season as well. Thank you so much for your time, Chris.
Thank you for having me, Adrian. I appreciate getting an opportunity to talk to you folks about the Vikings, and it's going to be an interesting season in 2018. It's been a very long off season, and thankfully that's almost over with.
Yeah, it has felt quite long, hasn't it? But yeah, we're almost there. So yeah, we've been talking to Chris Gates. He writes for the Daily Norseman, and you can give him a follow at Daily Norseman. Chris, thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me, Adrian. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Okay, thanks, Chris. I'll see you. Hopefully, talk to you next time.
Looking forward to it.
Well, that was our Vikings preview. We're talking to Chris Gates, as I said, from the Daily Norseman. He's, he's all across the Vikings, and it's going to be exciting to see what happens in Minnesota this year. Certainly, the Kirk Cousins signing will be front and center, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Hope you're enjoying our team previews. As I say always, thanks for listening. On behalf of G and myself, we'll catch you next time.